So I think it's off.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And is that working, Mui?
Yep. Yep.
Awesome.
Perfect.
So yes, hello. I am Ty Stanford. So I work with Associate Professor Nicole Pratt, and you'll notice Nicole's name is on this presentation because I've slipped in to take credit for her work because she's otherwise in other meetings and things like that. So I'm here just to let people know that the Legend study, which I'll go on to explain in a second, has an app available online for anyone to interrogate and potentially use themselves. And then the other thing I should say is the views expressed by me is not that of Nicole Pratt and the team that she worked with on Legend. Just in case I say anything wrong, maybe just blame her. So I guess credit also goes to the whole team, which is the usual suspects. So Professor Chan, Martin Shumi, Mark Suchard, and Patrick, and the list goes on. So the idea behind Legend, if I understand it correctly, is, of course, as OHDSI people, we know all about the patient level CDM, and we run single studies on that CDM, so that top line there, which requires lots of repeated efforts of writing protocols, developing code, executing that code, and compiling results if it's a network study. Then another option is developing an app that sits on top of that CDM and creating the code so you can review results on your particular database. But the idea behind Legend is to do a one-time, big effort, large-scale analytics. So there's a bunch of, I think it's either 9 or 10 huge databases, and they created a protocol and executed at a very large scale a whole bunch of analyses. So the results are always just sitting there ready to be used. So the goal of Legend was to generate real-world evidence on the effects of medical interventions using observational healthcare data to support clinical decision-making. So that's pretty straightforward and an excellent aim of any study. And how they did that is developing a comprehensive framework for doing observational healthcare science at scale. So it's pretty, I guess I can talk up this study because I wasn't part of it and I'm a big fan. They sort of created a way to do these large scale analytics that I've never seen before, and hopefully will pioneer future studies like what they did. So as people that work in observational health research, we've all heard about how observational data isn't good enough and clinical trials is the gold standard and all sorts of things, which are certainly fair criticisms, but a lot of them can be negated a certain way. So Nicole in her slides has got these pretty pictures. But the way my interpretation of these pictures is when we all do studies individually, there's lots of research degrees of freedom and different results come out from different ways of treating the data, creating the protocol, defining our exposures and outcomes and things like that. So the other thing there is maybe the data is a bit dirty, which is certainly true of observational data, but in Legend, I can't express how cool I think it is, but empirical calibration of the results goes a long way to making sure there's not systematic bias in the data. And of course, an issue we have in research is people p-hacking. That little meme there says it pretty well. So by doing this large scale analytics, there isn't that p-hacking because it's every analysis is treated the same and et cetera, and hopefully we'll avoid publication bias. So speaking of publication bias, Martin Shumi from OHDSI did, if I'm remembering the details correctly, did a sort of a web scrape of PubMed to look at trials comparing two treatments and particular outcomes, and plotted their effect size. So on the x-axis there is relative risk or hazard ratio. So the null value is 1, and then values less than 1 shows the target has a less of a risk, and greater than 1 has greater risk or greater effect, I should say. And then on the y-axis is the derived standard error from those confidence intervals. So you can see the red dotted V in that area would be the null result, where there's not a significant difference. And you see just outside the V, there's a whole bunch of what would be significant p-values relating to finding just significant results, which is a very good indication of publication bias. Sorry, yes, and I should have said each point in that plot is an individual study. Okay, so the Legend study was published in The Lancet, very prestigious, very lucky for those guys, or hard work for those guys. So Legend specifically, I haven't talked about the details of it. So they decided to use a highly prevalent indication, hypertension, so high blood pressure, and look at therapeutic agents on treating that and looking at the outcomes from that. So from previous research, we've got a circle there of different possible treatments of hypertension and prior comparisons between each of those drugs. So it looks like they found 40 previous trials for people with hypertension and taking particular drugs. I can't remember if these are randomized controlled trials or observational studies, but for our purposes, it doesn't particularly matter. So you can see there's some pairwise comparisons, but the research hasn't been fully fleshed out. This is still an active area of research because we don't know how all things compare. This is where Legend comes in. And because we have these fantastic databases, fantastic CDM, and fantastic people working on this CDM, the Legend study implemented the pairwise comparisons of these drugs to treat hypertension. So you can see we've got this effective coverage in the analysis. And so we, of course, need to define outcomes. So there's 55 outcomes of interest they defined. So you can see the scale keeps blowing up because we've got around 10 databases, N choose 2 of the treatments, and then we've got these 55 outcomes, and also there's some more details in there as well. But you can see as you multiply all these possibilities, it becomes very large scale. So it's fantastic this was able to be done. So yes, calibration and propensity score methods are other ways of looking at it. So of course I should say the analyses done were survival analysis, which can be computationally quite expensive. So once again, this large scale keeps getting bigger. Right, so we saw that plot before of publication bias. Well, we can interrogate the Legend study and say, how do the results look for pairwise comparisons between drugs and these 55 outcomes? And lo and behold, we get something we'd expect to see. So we've got a certain amount of symmetry, and not everything is sitting just in the significance area. So we can be reasonably confident in the results that they are reflecting the true state of things. Yes, how many? Over 1 million estimates. Incredible. Okay, so this is the part where others can get involved. So they've done all the hard work, but online is a way to interrogate these results. So I guess before I get to that, Martijn and the team, when creating these results, had a systematic way of storing the results, and they've got their own database with these results stored in that can be interrogated. So the Shiny app sits on top of this, and in a second I'll jump into that Shiny app to show you all about it. So I'll step through that. So this is the Legend basic viewer. So this is the landing page you'll end up on. So that's worth taking a note of if you want to have a play around it. And I guess the other things I should mention is you can find the paper that explains all the details that I've glossed over online, and there's some pretty comprehensive appendices to it as well. And I also love plugging this paper by the OHDSI team as well about the empirical calibration. Also a fantastic read, especially if you're sort of statistically minded or whatnot. But that's enough plugs from me. So you end up on this landing page and you can start to interrogate the results. So the indication is always hypertension, so there won't be any other choices. And you can look at major drug class, or particular drugs. So drug class might be a good place to start. So I might be interested in thiazides or thiazide-like diuretics, and we want to compare them to ACE inhibitors. So remembering these are the groups we're looking at. And then there's the 55 outcomes we can look at. So I'm just going to be boring and go abdominal pain. And you can also break it down by the databases they used. So I've just clicked on meta-analysis there to give us that 10,000 foot view, and then you can drill down further. And there's also different ways they treated the data. So PS stands for propensity score, and stratification and matching differ slightly in their approach. So matching I tend to think of as one-to-one matching between the two groups, so the thiazides and the ACE inhibitor groups, while PS stratification is saying if we have a certain propensity for each patient, we bin them and then adjust by those bins for the analysis. And then the other choices we've got there is on treatment and intention to treat. So intention to treat is looking at those patients beyond when they're on their thiazide or thiazide-like diuretics or ACE inhibitors. And then there's the on treatment, which restricts the time of follow-up to while they're strictly on those therapies. So because I've chosen all those specific selections, we only have one analysis remaining. So this analysis comparing thiazides to ACE inhibitors results in a hazard ratio of the meta-analysis of 0.9. So this is saying more or less that the outcome of abdominal pain is less likely for thiazides than it is for ACE inhibitors. And then it also provides confidence intervals, p-values. And then there's the all-important calibration on the right there. So this is where that empirical calibration comes in to try to remove systematic bias. I will say it again, but I absolutely love that method. So you can click on the analysis, and there's a whole bunch of tables and figures that can be produced from it. So you can see the number of patients within each of the databases and overall, which would be the meta-analysis. And you can see the rate of incidence per 1,000 people years. So you can kind of look, so if we look at the summary, we've got 82 divided by 85, and I assume that roughly correlates to the 0.9. Of course, it's a Cox proportional hazards model, not a Poisson model, but they should line up as well. Other important things to look at is, how am I going for time? propensity scores. So for the two groups, thiazides and ACE inhibitors, you can see with the propensity scores, they do have differing distributions, but there is some overlap as well, so you can interrogate how similar they are. Of course, the propensity score matching would mainly be using those in the darker purple area where there's matching propensity scores, and the stratification also deals with it by binning and weighting those groups. You might also be interested in the covariates in the model and how well they match up in the two groups, because of course we're not randomizing patients, it's an observational study, and you can see the before and after propensity score stratification to see how well propensity scores adjusted for potential confounders. This is an excellent demonstration of calibration versus non-calibration, how the null distributions won't be centered around the null result. So I think probably the best two plots to look at are these two here. So when we're uncalibrated, we can see all the points for the outcomes. Is this for, sorry, I think this is for negative controls. So we expect all negative controls plus or minus the alpha error to lie in this V. So there's a disproportionate amount falling outside of the V, which suggests there's some systematic bias. So when you apply the empirical calibration, suddenly we get the alpha level, the nominal alpha level that we'd expect, showing that that works quite well. And the last one is forest plot. So when it comes to meta-analysis, you'll be pretty familiar with those kinds of plots. So I think not only is my time run out, but that's probably enough for me. If you have any questions, send them to Nicole. No, just jokes. You can send them to me as well. I'll try.
Awesome. Thank you, Ty. So 1 minute or 2 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions for Ty on the Legend Our Shiny app? Okay. I agree with Ty. It is a very, very cool and amazing project. And as I showed you earlier, they are now looking at doing it for type 2 diabetes. The previous one that they did was on hypertension. And they would love to see more folks wanting to join it. And on the APAC side here, we're trying to repeat the same Legend exercise, which we presented, I think, a couple of calls before, where Professor Liu was showing you guys what we started with, which is just the treatment pathway and characterization. But our next step is to do the comparative effectiveness portion of it. But it would be great if you guys have an interest, reach out to the community on joining the type 2 diabetes one. They would love to see more partners instead of just 10, right? Although I think the other part is sometimes because it's so huge, some of the smaller data assets, what we found with experience, it just doesn't work because there's so many. It requires quite a bit of data in order to process. I can tell you when we tried to run it, it took us 2 days to run the whole thing. And it was huge. And I have pretty darn big servers, let's just say. But it still took us quite a bit of time to run the whole thing. So again, thank you both for presenting. They were wonderful and very, very interesting talks. And I will connect you guys with the vocabulary team. And if anyone has any questions on the Shiny app, please reach out to Ty. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your time. We shall talk to you guys again in 2 weeks. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. See ya.